Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, November 16th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Massachusetts and the gubernatorial race and how the Republican Party is effectively going to make themselves lose this governor race simply through a primary decision. This is how the GOP could very easily give up an otherwise winnable race for them in the 2022 midterm elections. Taking a look at the governor elections that are up in just about a year from now, we will see that many of these seats are deemed competitive. But one of them, by even my own projection, is the state of Massachusetts, in which I currently rate it as solid/safe for the GOP. This means the Republican Party is expected to win the state of Massachusetts on the governor level by a margin of 15 points or more. But this could completely change. The rating could go from safe Republican to safe Democrat practically overnight just by who the Republican nominee ultimately ends up being. Now, Charlie Baker is the most recent governor and the incumbent right now, who was first elected back in 2014 when he ran for the governorship against Martha Coakley, who is at the time the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts. Now, Charlie Baker didn't win by an overwhelmingly large margin at this point in time. He won by a margin of 1.9%. The victory here was more shocking because the state of Massachusetts had long been a Democratic stronghold, and this, combined with Larry Hogan's victory in the state of Maryland, ultimately showed that the pushback on President Obama had even reached solid Democratic states and poured into their governor elections. Then in 2018, in wave years for the Democratic Party, the state of Massachusetts again voted for Charlie Baker in the governor election, as did Maryland with Larry Hogan. Except this time, Massachusetts was more red. In fact, every single county voted to the right, including those inner parts of the Boston area, including Suffolk County, which was the closest county in the entire state that was decided by a margin of 1.2%. All around, Charlie Baker won across the state of Massachusetts with 67% of the vote. If you take a look at the 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden received just 66% of the vote, winning every single county for the Democratic Party. So to see Charlie Baker do even better than Joe Biden in 2018, in a year that wasn't good for the Republican Party, ultimately one would say Charlie Baker is on track to win re-election by a very solid margin. And I would say that it's true, with a caveat. If he makes it that far, he will win by a margin similar to that one. But it isn't that simple. While Charlie Baker may be a very popular governor, and I say this in full confidence knowing the approval rating of Charlie Baker, saying that he is one of the nation's most popular governors, his approval rating amongst Democrats in the state of Massachusetts is actually higher than it is amongst Republicans. Now, the reason for that is because Charlie Baker has been viewed as a rhino by many of these Republicans, a Republican in name only. And it also doesn't help that Donald Trump has been vilifying Charlie Baker, in fact, going to the furthest extent of endorsing a primary opponent against Charlie Baker. One of the few Republicans that has already announced their bid for the governorship has already been endorsed by Donald Trump. And this comes as a direct response to Donald Trump's decision in the past Charlie Baker's decision in the past to not support Donald Trump's re-election effort. What's happening in this state is that Donald Trump is interfering in the Republican primary, ultimately what will screw over the GOP's chances at victory. Who did Donald Trump endorse? The guy's name is, I believe you pronounce that name, Jeff, but I guess Jeff Deal is a former state representative, and he actually ran for Senate in 2018 against Elizabeth Warren. Now, he just received 36% of the vote. He lost by an astounding margin. Elizabeth Warren was easily reelected, even though in 2012, she actually only won by a margin of about 6 points across the state. So for her to win by over triple what her margin was in 2012 was certainly a big deal. But now he's running for governor and has already received the endorsement of Donald Trump. And what this endorsement has done is prompted him to become the frontrunner in the race, even against the incumbent governor. Now, I know this may seem like a stupid tactic, that this type of switching up of the GOP governor will obviously shift the race from safe red to safe blue. When blue states such as Massachusetts and other states that are of similar political leaning vote for the opposition party, this happens because these individual candidates are popular and well received. That is the case for Charlie Baker. It is not the case for any other Republican across the state. So to think that at some point that Charlie Baker or another Republican, could replace Charlie Baker in this governor election and win is absolutely naive. It is foolish to think that that is a possibility for the state of Massachusetts, because 2022, at least when it comes down to this governor election, will more than likely reject someone of a Trump-style campaign, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. His primary opponent, his major one at least, is someone who is considered to be a strong pro-Trump candidate. And with that enthusiasm from the Republican Party in terms of him being pro-Trump, I have no doubts that he will do well in a primary, but when it comes down to the general election, will ultimately fall flat on his face. And this is a completely preventable election. I mean, looking at Charlie Baker as the governor, if anything, he potentially could get some Democrats to cross over party lines and ensure that he wins the primary. But looking at Charlie Baker as a Republican, many Republicans do not look at him as one of their own. Considering the fact that Charlie Baker refused to endorse Donald Trump, told these Republicans everything that they needed to know when it came down to whether or not they would support his renomination to the Republican side. Because if they don't see him as a Republican, they aren't going to be either voting for him in the general election or they aren't going to be allowing him to make it through the primary. I think many of them would realize they'd much rather have Charlie Baker as an incumbent Republican governor rather than a Democrat, but I don't think they'd be happy with him being on the final ballot by the time we reach the 2022 midterm elections. But either way, I think that one is very different than the other, and that Charlie Baker could absolutely win re-election, but to assume that a Republican of a different type of level could definitely doesn't help. And also, I do want to point out that looking at the state's expected history and looking at the House composition, I mean, there is no real reason why Donald Trump even interjected himself into this race. Knowing that he lost the state of Massachusetts by 30 points or more should have been a sign enough in this state that he is not welcome when it comes down to individual endorsements or him just trying to speak on the race itself. And while this may have been pertaining to individually the Republican Party, if anything, Donald Trump would benefit from having Republicans on the top of the tickets winning when it comes down to states such as Massachusetts and other ones. But if voters aren't inclined to vote for the eventual Republican nominee, they will likely end up backing the Democratic Party. Otherwise, they might have voted in a different way. So looking at this upcoming election, I also think that it's entirely possible for another type of candidate to try to challenge Charlie Baker. But the point is that it's pretty much a done deal with this Trump endorsement. It is going to be a two-way race, and the difference here is actually very astounding. The fact that Charlie Baker is only receiving 29% of support in the public policy poll from October 2021 shows that less than a third of Republicans support him for a re-election bid. You have someone who has proven themselves time and time again that could very well jump into this election, hit the ground running, and win. I mean, these are things that the Republican Party needs to take advantage of, and they simply are not. Also, we have yet to see Charlie Baker officially enter into the 2022 election cycle. If you take a look at the numbers here, it's 50 to 29 with 21% undecided. Theoretically speaking, Charlie Baker could tie up this result 50% to 50% if he receives all 100% of that 21% that is undecided or was undecided at the time of the poll. But the fact that he's even in a competitive position to be primaried is very, very telling of the current state of the GOP. You're starting to see that internal divide rift again between the Trump wing of the Republican Party and the traditional, more expected conservative value type of Republican. Donald Trump has completely warped the way we look at the Republican Party altogether, and his influence is unmatched. Because I'm telling you now, with that endorsement, Charlie Baker probably will not win that primary. I think that some people will soon realize that this will prevent the Republican Party from winning altogether, but there will still be those people who are otherwise inclined to vote with Donald Trump, who are otherwise inclined to be loyal to Donald Trump, and will completely ignore the word of Charlie Baker. Some of these people, I think, would rather go out with the Trump candidate than have a Republican in name only win, and that's just a rhino as I'm characterizing it by the way that Donald Trump does. Even we've seen this in speeches before from Donald Trump, him saying more recently in the state of Georgia that the state of Georgia would probably be better off with Stacey Abrams as governor than Brian Kemp. Now, obviously, he was saying that in an effort to persuade Georgia voters to primary Brian Kemp, but Massachusetts is not Georgia. To try to treat this state as winnable, besides the Republicans that have already won, is to treat the race as just something that is not even thought about, not calculated in the fullest extent. I mean, Massachusetts takes heavy critical thinking for the Republican Party, whereas Democrats can waltz in and in 99% of situations win their elections. Very few exceptions come through, such as 2014, and even in 2010, it wasn't enough to oust an incumbent Democratic governor. You can see here that Deval Patrick defeated even Charlie Baker in the past. 4 years later, he decided to run and won again, but the point being that Deval Patrick beat him by a margin of 6.4%. So if Deval Patrick was able to defeat him in the state of Massachusetts, what is stopping potentially another Republican, another Democrat winning this governorship? Sorry about that. I don't know why. Whenever I wear my Apple Watch, for whatever reason, it decides to open up Siri in the middle of my recording, but all around, my point being that what's stopping 2010's result from being the actual result? Sure, it might narrow up. It might get closer than it was on the presidential level. I have no doubt in my mind about that after what we saw in New Jersey and Virginia. But what's to say a Republican will actually win? 2014 was a special circumstance, and also Barack Obama was disapproved of by a higher margin than what Joe Biden is today, and that margin was exceptionally close. But I also think that considering that this primary will come from a much less liberal Republican, will come from a much more conservative Republican, you are going to see voters turn out in ways that you didn't necessarily expect them to, and they will not be voting for these new Republicans the same way they did for Charlie Baker. Voters trust Charlie Baker for a reason. They believe that he is doing well amongst a very liberal state, and thus don't really feel any negative emotions towards him. You know, many Democrats have seemingly become complacent with the Charlie Baker governorship, primarily because nothing bad is happening in their eyes. Mainly because Democrats control the state of Massachusetts. I think that if the state was more evenly split, his type of political thinking and reasoning and campaigning would change as well. But for right now, he's very much throttled by the Democratic state legislature, and that's why he remains so popular. But with that popularity comes a re-election, and it keeps the state red. When it comes down to the final map here, it's an additional number for the GOP that they otherwise would not have. The same thing can be applied to the state of Maryland, which with Larry Hogan's retirement, I have already rated as safe Republican. This can also be applied to the state of Vermont, a state with a strong Republican history in the pathway, but more recently has shifted towards the Democrats in a very, very favorable fashion towards them. Now Vermont could end up being that state. But looking at it, Vermont will likely end up being blue if the incumbent chooses to retire, Phil Scott, and that's just how things work. The state of New Hampshire could go a different way. It really depends. It's a toss-up state. Chris Sununu, obviously very popular, deciding to run for re-election. That race will probably go pretty solidly to the Republican Party, but in an eventual open race, there's no doubt in my mind that New Hampshire would be as close as well. So what I see across many of these states, and specifically in the state of Massachusetts, is that the answer is obvious. The GOP is shooting themselves in the foot by deciding to pressure Baker either not to run or deciding to run somebody against him. The GOP should acknowledge that they have not won a presidential election in the state of Massachusetts in an extremely long time. I think the last time might have been 1984 when Massachusetts went red by a margin of 2.8%. It didn't hold out like it did in 1972. Ronald Reagan was the last Republican to win the state of Massachusetts on the national level. That was 1984. That was nearly 40 years ago. So for Ronald Reagan to be the last one to win the state of Massachusetts also tells you it's super strong Democratic history compared to years prior. In fact, from the year 2000 to 2020, Massachusetts has swung 6 points Democratic. From 1984 to now, 36 points more Democratic. Even 2016 to now, Massachusetts is 6 points more Democratic. So taking a look at the change in overall sentiment and support for the Democrats in the state of Massachusetts, it would just be foolish and absolutely unreasonable to think that a Republican should run besides Charlie Baker and should even primary him, which fractures the party even more. Because even though Charlie Baker may not necessarily be the favorite based off of this preliminary election data or based off of what the endorsements tell us with Donald Trump endorsing Jeff Deal, I do think that a fractured party will prohibit many things from being very seamlessly, very smooth and seamless. At the end of the day, this will be a contested primary, But I do think that, once we reach the general election, it will not be contested whatsoever, and the Republicans will lose a seat that they otherwise might have been counting on and could very well have won had they just nominated or had they focused on pushing for Charlie Baker to run for re-election and choose him again from the state. But it is very clear that Donald Trump is actively seeking revenge, is targeting the state of Massachusetts, and I am very intrigued to see what the steps are moving forward for Charlie Baker. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.